My favourite section in the library is the 750s, which is the section for books on painting. This is where I spent most of my undergraduate degree researching for my thesis on early Italian Renaissance fresco painting, with some brief detours to the 121s, 610s and 133s. But there is a peculiarity in the 751s that always caught my attention. The 751s are for books about specific painting techniques, and the part of the 751s I spent a lot of time in was the section for fresco paintings. This is where you'll find books on fresco paintings, ancient ones from the medieval period, from the Renaissance period. Most noticeably, you'll see tons and tons of books on Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. But it's also where you'll find books on Banksy. And the reason for this is very simple. According to the rules of the Dewey Decimal System, when it comes to artistic technique, there's no difference between Michelangelo and Banksy. It's all just paint on a wall. In this video essay, I'm going to be talking about what Michelangelo and Banksy have in common, what they don't have in common, how this glitch in the Dewey Decimal System happened in the first place, and ultimately what it reveals about the kinds of values that we place on different artistic mediums. Now, for those of you who don't know how the Dewey Decimal System works, here's a quick rundown. The system was created in the 1870s in the United States by a man called Melville Dewey. He suggested a library system based on the topics of the books in the library. Previously, libraries had stored the books based on the order of acquisition or maybe the author's surname, other kinds of systems. But Dewey's system assigned number categories to different topic areas, and each number category could be expanded indefinitely with decimal points. There are other library classification systems nowadays, but Dewey's one is still the most popular in the Western world. And because it's so old, it has a lot of problems. Whole new fields of science, arts, technology have been invented since Dewey's time, and it's left librarians with the tricky task of trying to squeeze them in, shuffle around existing categories. Some categories have been completely abandoned and are no longer used because the topics in those fields have been absorbed into other categories. The Dewey Decimal System has also rightfully been accused of being highly Anglo-American and Eurocentric in its prioritization of topics. For example, Dewey assigned religion to the 200s, but nearly all of the 200s was dedicated to Christianity, leaving only the 290s for other religions of the world. Also in the history section, each continent has its own category, but Australia, New Zealand, all the Pacific Island nations, Antarctica are all squeezed into the 990s along with extraterrestrial worlds. Australasia's footnote-like status is a recurring theme in the Dewey Decimal System. These faults, though, are what I think makes the Dewey Decimal System so interesting. The way information is ordered and prioritized in the Dewey Decimal System tells us a lot about the values of our culture. Each revision to the system, and there's been a lot of revisions, tries to keep it up to date. But like so much of our society today, the Dewey Decimal System has been unable to completely unshackle itself from its 19th century origins. The ways the Dewey Decimal System orders ideas can be very revealing of the ingrained and long-held biases of our culture, in particular in academia and cultural institutions. And this brings us back to Michelangelo and Banksy. Now, of course, we know there are a lot of differences between Michelangelo and Banksy. The most obvious one being that Michelangelo was an artist who lived 500 years ago in Italy, whereas Banksy is a contemporary anonymous street artist who's still active today. Michelangelo was commissioned to do his work in some of the most prestigious buildings of his era, whereas Banksy paints on the street without permission, in public, and often in an illegal way. Because of this, Banksy's work is very quick to produce. It's often just a stencil and some paint, whereas Michelangelo's frescoes took years to complete, and he even employed a whole team of assistants to help him. Banksy and Michelangelo do share some similarities though. Michelangelo gained a celebrity-like status during his own lifetime, and despite choosing to remain anonymous, Banksy is probably one of the most famous artists living today. Both artists have been called geniuses, and both have created controversial works. Most of us are pretty familiar with the challenging themes of Banksy's work: war, politics, the environment, poverty. But Michelangelo's work caused some controversy too. The naked figures of the Sistine Chapel ceiling were considered too risque by the Vatican at the time, so they had another artist come in and paint little cloths over the figures' genitals to keep them modest. But to most people, the differences between Michelangelo and Banksy seem a lot more obvious than the similarities, and I would say that most people would feel that it's a bit incorrect to group them together. It's the kind of grouping that makes us uncomfortable. What I like so much about this quirk in the Dewey Decimal System is that it forces us to confront some of the subjective categories that are so present when we talk about art history. Placing street art on the same bookshelves as Renaissance frescoes reminds us of the hierarchies present in art history, which brings me to part 2. Since the origins of the field of art history and fine art theory, there's been what we call a hierarchy of mediums, which just means that we've assigned different values to different forms of art. In the Western tradition, this usually begins with sculpture at the top of the tier, because it was considered by the ancient Romans and Greeks to be the most prestigious art form, and that kind of tradition has carried on. Right up there next to sculpture is painting, which is also considered to be highly valuable. It takes a lot of skill to execute. Further down the hierarchy, you have things like drawing, watercolour, some forms of printmaking like etching, engraving, and at the bottom of the hierarchy, you have things like the decorative arts, so glasswork, pottery, textile arts, embroidery, all of those kinds of things. And today, street art usually occupies one of the lower tiers, but it depends on who you ask, of course. If you ask my father, he would say it doesn't deserve a place on there at all. The important thing to note about the hierarchy of medium, though, is that it changes from time to time and from place to place. For example, in the Renaissance period, tapestry was considered to be a top-tier medium, mainly because of the astronomical cost it took to produce and the unimaginable amount of labour. In fact, the Renaissance master Raphael was commissioned in 1515 to design 10 monumental tapestries that were to hang around the walls of the Sistine Chapel below Michelangelo's ceiling. Raphael's designs were sent to Peter van Aalst's workshop in Brussels, which was considered to be the best tapestry workshop of the time. Now, these tapestries cost 15,000 gold ducats, which is approximately 2 million euros in today's money. In comparison, Raphael was only paid 1,000 ducats for his designs. All up, the tapestries cost 5 times the amount paid to Michelangelo to paint the ceiling. But today, it's Michelangelo's ceiling that people flock to see, not the tapestries. This is partially due to the fact that the tapestries are no longer hung in the Sistine Chapel because they're too fragile. But I also think it's because we just don't find tapestry as impressive anymore. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, textiles tapestries have become way cheaper and easier to produce, so they no longer hold a top spot on the hierarchy for us. In fact, the Industrial Revolution shook up the centuries-old hierarchy of medium in other ways too, namely with the invention of photography. Despite its revolutionary impact on society and culture, photography was not really considered a high art form until the late 20th century. From its invention in the 1820s and 1830s, photography was largely seen as a recording tool or a scientific pursuit rather than an art form. Some photographers were really eager to change this perception of photography, and they formed societies like the Royal Society of Photography in London in 1853 and the Société Française in 1854. A key talking point in the early days of these societies was how to make your photographs more artistic. And many photographers started imitating the composition, subject matter, and even the aesthetics of painting. But it would take decades, almost a century, for photography to be considered a worthy enough medium to be taught in art schools and exhibited frequently in exhibitions. Aside from these adjustments in the 19th century, the biggest shake-ups to the hierarchy of medium came in the 20th. Since the postmodern artistic revolution of the 20th century, artists have cared a lot less about the mediums that they use. When artists started to value the concepts of their work over the medium and execution of that medium, the hierarchy of medium lost some of its power and influence. Postmodernism brought conceptual art, and for conceptual artists, the value of their work lay in the concepts and ideas behind the piece rather than in the piece's material nature. For example, a Duchamp ready-made does not hold very much material value, and also, unlike a painting or a marble sculpture, it doesn't require a lot of skill to make, but it's their rejection of what art should be that makes the ready-mades so important to art historians and collectors, and what's earned them very hefty price tags. Contemporary art today consists of such a diverse array of materials and practices. There's still painters, sculptors, printmakers, but there's also video artists, performance artists, installation artists, and lots of artists who work across multiple mediums. This doesn't, however, mean that the hierarchy of mediums has been completely dissolved. If you take a glance around any major gallery, you'll see that we still value particular mediums from particular time periods very highly. Even among contemporary artists, painters and sculptors are still regarded very highly. In fact, the most expensive artworks sold by living artists are still paintings and sculptures. And when it comes to street art, aside from the select few like Banksy who've become very popular, most street art is still considered a low art form with very little commercial viability or potential. And this brings us to the most important thing about the hierarchy of mediums. Although the hierarchy of mediums is subjective and differs from time to time and place to place, it is always directly linked to the monetary value of the artworks in question. I would argue that three things determine this value. The first is the value of the raw materials needed to create the piece. The second is the value of the labor or skills needed to work those materials into an artwork. And the third is the cultural value and meaning assigned to the work. It is the last of these three which is the most subjective. Over time, an artwork's material value may degrade. Its colours may fade, it may tarnish, the materials used in it may lose value in the market. People may forget the value of the labour needed to create it, or perhaps new technologies and techniques make it not seem very impressive anymore. We may even simply forget the cultural value of an artwork. That it once meant something important to someone can easily be lost over time. But if the story of an artwork endures, if we continue to ascribe cultural meaning to it over time, then its value increases exponentially. This is why galleries buy Banksy pieces and elevate them to the status of high art, far from their urban street origins. The mythology of Banksy, a mysterious, anonymous street artist making paintings about humanity in unlikely places, this mythology is just as powerful as the story of any Renaissance genius. Who knows what old Melville Dewey would think if he knew that street art now occupied the same library shelves as Renaissance frescoes. I do think he would be comforted to know that his system is still so widespread today. But even though the boundaries for what is considered art and what isn't have shifted over the past century, I don't think Dewey would see much difference between his world and ours when it comes to how we value artworks and artists. It may all just be paint on a wall, but what matters, and what has always mattered, is that we decide to call it art. Thank you so much for watching. This is my first in what I hope is a long series of video essays on art and visual culture, particularly intersections with technology. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate it if you gave it a like. Send it to anyone you know who's interested in art or art history, and let me know what you think about the themes and ideas raised in this video down below in the comments. You can follow me on Twitter and TikTok, and turn on notifications if you'd like to know when my next video is out.